During Mr Peachey's call, Tau Hinerai shouted out that the Labour Party on this side of the House was engaged in fascism by opposing this bill. Well, I've got news for Mr Hinerai. What we're doing on this side of the House is protecting the clause that the National Party supported by Mr Hinerai when he was in Māori Pacific, and in fact advocated for by Mr Hinerai when he was in Māori Pacific. We're trying to protect his work, and he calls that fascism. That's what Mr Hinerai is doing. He's calling his own clause fascism, because Mr Hinerai was part of a government that came up with a solution that gave student associations choice. It gave students' associations choice. I congratulate Mr Hinerai. He made sure that there was a choice for students' associations if enough members of that association wanted there to be voluntary membership. They could get a referendum through, and then there was a vote. And in fact, under this bill put forward by Heather Roy, that choice gets wiped out. The choice that Mr Hinerai put into the law is now wiped out as a result of this bill. The Auckland University Students' Association went through that process. It's now voluntary. That's gone under this bill. You actually don't have that ability to make that choice as a student. So the fascism that Mr Hinerai accuses us of is actually his own work. We're defending his own work. Mr Chair, Clause 6A in fact applies the clauses of this bill to private training establishments. And I think we've seen enough information in the media in recent times to indicate that the students involved in many private training establishments are in fact very vulnerable, because we've seen a number of examples of students enrolled in private training establishments who have actually had their money ripped out of their pockets for very little return. The role of a students' association, the role of student movements within private training establishments, in fact, is becoming increasingly important, because value for money, making sure you actually get a qualification at the end of the day, is an important part of what students' associations do. Students' associations are there every single day in institutions around the country, making sure that students get value for money, that they can stay in their education. And during the consideration of this clause in this part of this bill, in the Select Committee process, Mr Peachey, Louise Upston, Colin King, the National Party members of that committee, they heard the submissions, the overwhelming submissions that said we should keep the status quo. The institutions, all bar one, who came to the committee and said, please do not pass this bill, we believe in what students' associations are doing. Mr Peachey heard all of those submissions, and he knew, and Mr Peachey and Louise Upston knew, that they needed to do something to stop this bill going through. They knew, perhaps with some mitigation, perhaps something around more referendum opportunities, perhaps something around an opt-out clause for students. Mr Peachey knew that was a better option. Louise Upston knew that was a better option. And then all of a sudden that went out the window, and the National Party kowtowed to ACT. The National Party simply went along with ACT. And as my colleague Moana Maki has pointed out via interjection, Paul Hutchison went to the NZUSA conference before the last election and said National will not support voluntary student membership. They will not support what's been done by Clause 6A here today. That's what the National Party said before the election, but after the election, that's out the door. Just like GST not going up, that's out the door. The commitment of the National Party to actually stick with a workable solution for student association membership, completely rejected out of hand after this election as part of a deal with the ACT Party. Well, that deal with the ACT Party will mean that students right across tertiary institutions in New Zealand will lose the important advocacy and representation that is given to them by students' associations, be they in a public institution or a private institution. They will lose the ability of those students' associations to provide services, because that's the evidence, that's the real evidence of what happened in Australia when this was passed. 75% of the services provided by students' associations disappeared when voluntary student membership came in, and there's no doubt that the same thing will happen here. And the real vulnerability, Mr Chair, is actually not for those students who are in Mr Chair. The real vulnerability is not just for those students who are in polytechnics and universities, but also in small institutions, in small polytechnics, and in institutions where there isn't going to necessarily be some kind of contract for service between the institution and the student association, where the student association will end up withering and dying on the vine, and that will mean that those students do not have representation. Because what Clause 6A does is refer us back to the changes that were made under Clause 6, and quite clearly within those there is the substantive change that moves from a situation of universal membership to voluntary membership, Clause 229A. This was the area where compromise was on the table. This was where the Labour Party members were prepared to look for an enduring solution so that this doesn't flop around with each change of government. And mark my words, with a Labour government it will change back. And we've said that in the Minority Report. It will change back. But what we could have had was an enduring agreement. Mr Peachey wanted an enduring agreement, and that would have been one where we would have looked at something like more regular referenda, or we would have looked at an opt-out clause. That was on the table, but instead with 229A, that goes off the table, and we move to a situation where the choice of students to actually decide whether their association will be compulsory or voluntary, Mr Henare's clause, is out. That is gone. But, Mr Chair, also within what is now being put in place in 6A for private institutions is 229B, the question of undue influence. Now, I've often wondered with the change to this clause that there is the clause around undue influence is so ill-defined as to what undue influence might actually constitute. And certainly I know in student associations right around the country, they will often run orientation activities which will include all manner of things that are part of perhaps buying an orientation ticket. Is the promoter of this bill seriously saying that undue influence could extend to whether or not an orientation ticket had some free beer in it or something like that? Is that the extent of undue influence? We don't know, because 229B is so ill-defined. And the reason why I'm raising that under this clause, Mr Chair, is because Clause 6A applies 229A through to 229C to private training establishments. How will we know what undue influence is? What procedures will really be in place to ensure that undue influence is not exerted? And 229C runs through the complaints process. It runs through the process that people will be able to undertake in terms of undue influence, but it does not give us any kind of accurate definition of what that might be. So in addition, Mr Chair, to taking away the choice of students' associations as to whether they will be voluntary or compulsory, what this does is, in addition, put in place an unworkable, in my view, situation around the question of undue influence. Mr Chair, another important matter that is now covered in terms of private training establishments by Clause 6A is around the question of for what reason fees can be collected. And 229CA tells us that no person is required to pay a membership fee to a students' association or to pay money to any other person as an alternative to paying such a membership fee unless that person chooses to become a member of an association. It then goes on to say a person who is not a member of a student association may not be required to pay a representation fee to that association for any services that the association generally provides to the institution's student body. What this is about...
Part of this is on... You're talking about Part 6 here. We're on 6A.
Oh, point of order, Mr Chair.
Point of order.
Mr Chair, 6A applies sections 229A to 229C to private training establishments. To give it any meaning whatsoever, we would need to discuss that.
I hear what you're saying. You must tie it back into all right.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So what we're saying for students who are enrolled in private training establishments, that should there be a situation in which those private training establishments accept some kind of an arrangement with a students' association in those private training establishments, that student association could, that fee that was being charged perhaps by the institution directly to the students, could not be for any kind of representational activity of a students' association. And to me that is completely nonsensical. We also have the situation now where...
Point of order, the Honourable Rick Barker.
Point of order, Mr Chair. I have just been to the table to look for a copy of this bill, and there's no copy of the bill, this bill on this side of the table. And I don't think this debate can continue whilst there's no copy of the bill for the opposition members to consider. And I suggest this debate stop immediately until there's a copy.
There are...
Hello.
We're having...
Point of order.
Speaking to the point of order.
Point of order. That member walked across the House without acknowledging the chair. Sure. That is utterly disorderly.
Yes, I'll ask the member to sit down. I'll rule on this matter. While there might not be copies on this side, and I appreciate the member bringing it to our attention, the clerk has asked for further copies to be delivered. There are copies, however, on this side of the table, and there's no requirement to have them on each side of the table. It's just so long as the bill has been tabled and there are copies on the table. The point's been made. We now have copies specifically on this side. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Honourable Rick Barker.
It's made a point of order. The Honourable Tau Henare walked across the House without recognising the chair, and that is disrespectful to the chair.
Well,
I expect you to bring it to order.
I thank you for that, and I did ask the member to resume his seat and to sit down. That's the end of the matter. Let's move on. The call goes... Point of order.
Further point of order.
Further point of order.
While I was undertaking my point of order, the Honourable Tau Henare threw a copy of the bill at me. I don't think that's a very orderly manner to conduct himself in either.
No.
If the member wants to help me, then I would...
Thank you. The member's made his point well, and I asked the member to resume his seat and to sit down. That's the end of the matter. He has erred. I've told him to sit down, resume his seat, and that's the end of the matter. Now, we have... The call is in... who has the call now? Point of order.
Do I have remaining, Mr Chair?
You have 22 seconds.
I have 22 seconds. I'll make it good, Mr Chair.
On Part 6A.
On Part 6A, which applies to private training establishments, sections 229A and 229C. And I do note in my remaining seconds, as future people take the call, that Alan Peachy in his initial contribution on Clause 6A didn't mention Clause 6A once. He actually only talked about Clause 6, so I'm sure it is a wide-ranging debate, Mr Chair.
The Honourable Tau Henare.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.